Hi, I'm Rowan Ostrom, founder of Beyond Careers. Welcome to another episode of Boardrooms and Breakthroughs. According to the World Economic Forum's latest Global Gender Gap Report, it will take us 134 years to reach full parity, and that's roughly 5 generations behind the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals target. Today, I'm joined by Katy Holmes, CEO of the British Chamber of Commerce Dubai, and Helen McGuire, exited founder and author, to discuss the global gender gap and the role and potential for women in the boardroom. It's great to have you both here. Ladies, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Board diversity. Let's start with that. Why is it a good thing for companies?
I just sighed. That's what I just sighed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, look, I think
I didn't know it was a loaded question.
Well, it kind of is, I think, because there's so much that needs to be done, and it can't all boil down to, the magic quotas and so on. But I think that, for me, the selling point of board diversity for any business is the fact that it then hopefully filters down to the rest of the company. Diversity of voices in a business is super important. We've all read the stats, we've all read the reports. These things are not new. Profitability of businesses goes up by up to 35% when you have more diversity. With gender diversity, that only increases. Innovation is also hugely impacted when you look at the stats in terms of consumers. In the US alone, I think it's something like 90% of household buying decisions are made by women. If you don't have that diversity represented within your business, how are you capturing that potential?
That demographic.
So yeah, I think, when we're talking about diversity in general, it's super important. And if that's not represented at board level, then it's very difficult for the rest of the company to perhaps change in positive ways.
Katy, yeah, I know you.
Echoing all of that, but also adding, it's big decisions being made that ultimately affect lives, clients, stakeholders. To have the kind of emperor's new clothes mentality around a board table just isn't going to work. So one of my favorite analogies in the diversity space is, by not celebrating and having that coverage of diversity, it's like having the most amazing orchestra where 2/3 of the instruments is left in their box. So it's a real opportunity, and obviously you have to have people that are prepared to listen to those diverse views as well.
Right.
You say tick the boxes and you've got a great diverse board, but you need to have the allies in that room as well to encourage the diverse feedback and challenges.
That's such a beautiful analogy, the orchestra. I love it. So in saying that, how do you select the right board? What advice would you give to organizations in board selection?
When you look globally at how this has been organized previously, it doesn't look particularly diverse. And I think that is the major challenge. And that's why we've seen some of the legislation come in the EU, for example, in the last couple of years, in Singapore in the last 18 months, 2 years, here in the UAE as well, in order to change that and to push things forward. As Katy rightly said, it's not just about having that representation, it's about having the voices there and listening to them and acting on them. And I think in order to select the right people for those seats around a table, we don't want to look just at all the traditional skill sets potentially, we want to broaden it out a little bit. And here I'm including not just things like gender, but also age diversity, looking at different opinions, looking at people who are perhaps a bit older, definitely younger, so that you've got that broad sense of whatever industry it is that you're in, that representation of whoever it is you're trying to attract or sell to, rather than just a kind of tick box of, well, this person has the legal requirements to sit on the board, this person has the financial background and experience to sit on this board. So I think it's just broadening that out from a diversity perspective as much as anything else.
Well, also people buy from people, so it's really that relatability to some extent, right?
I think so. I think, when I think about diversity and inclusion, representation really is the cornerstone of it. So having that within a business, if you're working in advertising, representing the people that you're trying to attract, whether that's clients or whether it's end consumers is super important. And that cannot look like one particular type of person and background. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I just want to come to the point you mentioned about age diversity. Touching on that, I know, Katy, very recently you have led and you've been part of the steering committee and a founding member of the Menopause Summit. Now, considering that, I assume many women in their leadership roles, when they're sort of entering that next era, if you will, are somewhere in their 40s and 50s, coinciding with that sort of season of their lives. Katy, what advice would you have there in terms of your insights?
Yeah, I mean, so just fresh off the GCC's first Menopause Summit, there was a lot of research that went into that to make it a relevant event for the region. And yeah, that bracket, stereotypically 45 to 55 is the age of a board director, but also when women who do have symptoms through the menopause, they're going to feel it the most intensely there. So speaking to a lot of the delegates and through the panel conversations, lack of confidence is something that comes through at that time of year, of life. Brain fog.
Yeah, we've heard that along with the hot flashes. And
yes, and just, still able to do your job, and that's really important to stress, but just needing some kind of allowances and support. So it's kind of like the role of the employer as well to make sure that advice is around for women that going through that stage of life. Not all women go through symptoms of the menopause. It's important to note, not to rule out everybody, just in the same way of hiring somebody in their early 30s and thinking, oh, she's going to be pregnant. It doesn't necessarily mean that.
Yeah. It's very unique to the individual.
Yes, exactly. So particularly looking at the menopause and the board diversity, I think the more awareness around it to support that female in the workplace, building that confidence, empowering them with their own health, will increase the pool of talent basically to then lead to more diversity.
Absolutely,
and
more opportunities to make a diverse hiring decision. I read somewhere that I think that stat probably came off the Menopause Summit as well, that 1 in 4 women leave the workforce around coinciding with the menopause, as well as the fact that 25% of employers have actually caught up with supportive policies and systems. What would typically be, and this is a question for both of you, what would you recommend in terms of, again, I understand that there's no one size fits all, and the conversation does get a bit nuanced because you're talking about different personalities, different people, needs, wants, etc., and balancing that with commercial viability of a business. How does a business successfully implement policies that make sense, that are actually mutually successful for both candidates as well as their corporate direction?
I mean, it's a huge question. It's something that businesses have struggled with, and certainly have struggled very hard with, I think, over the last 5 years when it's been much more in the spotlight. And I think if we only focus on gender, then we're really kind of minimizing the problems that they face, because the issues of inclusion are huge when we bring into consideration things like neurodiversity, for example, things like disability, which, disability affects about 1.2 billion people on the planet, which is a huge proportion. I think, again, it goes back to the top-down element of this, and again, to an extent, goes back to board level, because if you're not represented at that level as a person, whether that's because of gender, whether that's race, ethnicity, whether it's disability, then it's very difficult to make proper decisions, and decisions that actually make sense for the people who are working for you, as well as to then attract more of those people and include more of those people in your workforce. And that can look like, many different things. Certainly flexibility is helpful in terms of location, in terms of hours and so on. But also the physical space, providing that opportunity for women, particularly whether they're going through the menopause, whether they are breastfeeding, for example, whether they have young children. And again, from a disability perspective and a neurodivergent perspective, there are so many different ways of looking at this. But it's very hard to understand that, and it's very hard to put that into practice if you don't have somebody or representation at the top of a business making those decisions and putting those policies and practices in place, because it cannot come from just the employees themselves. Those changes will take so much longer.
And to be slightly controversial as well is that that whole tick box exercise can massively backfire. So in my personal opinion, worse than having no women represented on the board is having the worst woman represented.
We're wanting meaningful change, right?
Yeah, so when companies hire females particularly to fill quotas that haven't been correctly screened, it has a detrimental effect on men and women through that organisation. So it's such a huge responsibility, and it's, like you say, it's a huge task to fulfil, but it's such careful consideration. Getting it right, then huge benefits, but getting it wrong can be disastrous as well.
I would agree with that, and I think my issue, I suppose, or my question mark a lot of the time around quotas is I think it's a great start, and we've seen those improvements. I mean, if you look at the figures in Singapore, 2013 there were about 7% of women, or boards made up of 7% women. Now it's increased to almost 30%. So you can see it has a huge impact. But as Katy correctly says, not just from a gender perspective, but from any perspective, you need to be making decisions based on the suitability of that candidate. And yes, it doesn't need to be perhaps as narrow as traditional board selection criteria have been, but that person does need to be a good representation, let's say, of somebody that should be sitting around that table.
The best fit for the role.
Because otherwise the change is not sustainable. Right. And I think actually we go backwards and there starts to be a kind of flip against it where, we actually start to see a detrimental effect.
It's a little counterintuitive.
Yeah.
No, I hear you. Just again, talking to your point earlier, Helen, about the whole wide-ranging what diversity, equity, inclusion really stands for. We're touching on age, we're touching on disabilities, the ones we can see and the ones we can't. Let's also talk a little bit around motherhood and the motherhood penalty, as we know that this also has a huge effect. And we've seen in the return to work survey results that several women leave the workforce having children. And so there's this whole plethora of different, I mean, I'm not only saying it's limited to women, men have their own challenges as well, but let's just say that there's a few more challenges that we need to get through to close the gap.
Definitely.
Motherhood penalty exists, yes, no, what are your thoughts?
It for sure exists. I mean, I don't know if penalty is the right word, but disadvantage, I think, is probably more accurate for many mothers, and I think still in this region, that's an issue, as as you've discovered through your survey, as we all know from our experience. Look, I think there are multiple different answers to this question. Should it exist? No. And I feel as though actually it's a very old-fashioned way of looking at the suitability of somebody for a role. So rather than looking at what skills they have, whether they're soft skills or hard skills, what qualifications this person might have, people look more deeply at dates, so the CV gap, which is just total nonsense, because the amount of things you learn as a person who has taken leave from the workforce and has built other skills in other areas is huge, as we all know. We're all mothers, we all get that. But equally, I think the onus is then on the mother to make those changes, whereas actually, if we start to think about it more from a parenting perspective, and we start to give equal responsibility to both parents and equal opportunity to both parents to be involved in this process, which, let's face it, is 50-50, then I think we start to see some changes. And you see those changes in countries, Nordic countries particularly, where there is equal parenting leave, and the return rate of mothers is something like 80% into the workforce in Finland. So that has a massive impact beyond just kind of saying, the soft stuff around, women gain more skills or whatever it may be. There actually needs to be some policy and practice in place that ensures that the onus is not just on women to prove themselves in this space and to make all the extra efforts. There's so much more that can be done outside of that.
Okay. I think it was a positive that came out of the pandemic, personally anyway, that suddenly both parents are at home both
More
are opening the
involved.
fridge, seeing that the milk's running
Yeah.
low, both becoming quite domesticated and ordering off Amazon. I mean, that was certainly in our household. And for me personally, it was one of the best things because I went back out to work sooner than my husband. My husband was working from home, forced to work from home through the company policy. And the roles reversed, and it was amazing. And our daughters benefited from having the extra time with him, but also there was this greater appreciation for each other. So yeah, like you say, it's a parenting issue. Going back to kind of looking at women in the workplace, I was part of the group of young women coming up through the bank I was working at that would see a woman that was pregnant, and it's embarrassing to think, and I'll be really honest, I would see them as dropping out.
Oh.
So actually sometimes it can be women against women in this
Yeah.
situation. And it was like this kind of general thing of like, oh, they're going on maternity leave, I'm going to end up with all the work. And sure enough, when I was in that position, I felt so ashamed of my ignorance around it. So I think we have to look really broadly as well and understand just the greater appreciation for everybody's life through different changes, whether you do or don't have children, whether you step out of the career, whether you accelerate your career. It's just, just being a little bit more people-centric generally.
And having that empathy.
Empathy is key, absolutely. And going back to talking about kind of company policies are great, but then they have to be implemented in action. So having somebody on the board that's responsible for that kind of ESGC element of the company, really making sure that the directors are in place and people are benefiting. Otherwise, you also end up with this kind of toxic positivity around, oh, we're all doing, everybody's doing everything great and we're ticking all boxes. And actually, there is then the knock-on effect of people that aren't included in that gender or diversity initiative.
And that leaves undercurrents or pockets
Totally,
of
It's endless.
discontentment, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah.
I wanted to touch on, Katy, you probably have some examples as well of companies that have, not asking to name any names necessarily, but just what do you feel in terms of policy has worked? Again, that's, I'd say, diverse and supportive across the board. Have you noticed any sort of case studies that you can speak about or share?
Yeah, so there's some amazing examples of making flexible and hybrid working. I'm very pro that. I understand there are some roles that can't work from home at any point through the week, so I'm understanding of that. But where there is flexibility around companies offering that hybrid, I've seen amazing examples of that through the membership. Interesting, sort of digging deeper below that, understanding why companies then revert back to full-time in the workplace. It's usually because of a very small minority of employees that have either taken advantage or just not implemented it in the most transparent of ways. And that's a shame, a real shame on the majority where somebody's not understood it. So seeing great examples of it in practice, it really upsets me to see when they kind of snap back because they've said it hasn't worked, but it's not that it hasn't worked, it just hasn't worked for a small
Well, there are some
minority.
large international examples that we can draw reference to very recently, and I think it's brought in a variety of positive and negative, and I think a lot more negative in terms of how it's being viewed. Is it a setback for women?
I think it's a setback for inclusion. Mandating 5 days a week in the workplace is only going to narrow your talent pool. It's as simple as that, because that, as we've all seen traditionally, simply doesn't work for probably 50% of the population, frankly. So if that's your aim, then, well done. You've achieved it. But I think, generally speaking, for most businesses, they recognize the value of different inputs, different perspectives, different types of people as part of their workforce, and flexibility is one way to guarantee that. But I think flexibility without support, without necessary space and focus, I think
Agreed.
for us as, mums working from home, if you've got 2-3 kids running around,
Can be pretty chaotic.
it's not like that's stressful. That's not, that's not helpful for anybody. You're too kind of fragmented and diluted in what you're trying to do. So just making sure, I suppose, that setup is there, that the option is there to go into an office or into an organised space. I don't think anybody massively enjoys working 5 days from. I know I don't. You know, it drives me a bit mad after a while. I just need to be around other people who are also working. And I think when we're talking about motherhood particularly, and potentially also for something like the menopause and for lots of other areas of life, you know, for women, life is seasonal. It's not the same as it is for a man, purely on a hormonal basis. It's biology. There's nothing we can really do to get around that, but we can support that. And I think having some off-ramps, having some on-ramps when you're going through maternity leave is super helpful. I know that when I went back after maternity with my first baby, I couldn't remember how to left click on my Mac. Just couldn't, you know, I couldn't just basic. Obviously, I got there pretty quickly, but you know, it's just those kind of realizations of I've not been in this environment doing this job or having to.
It's like switching from Windows to Mac.
It's switching, right? It's kind of that constant
operating systems.
Absolutely, the operating systems that I think women have in their brains are multiple. So giving them the opportunity to have some support around that, to understand that, to not lose confidence just because some of those small things happen, is really, really helpful. And that's what I've seen as useful in a, you know, in a working environment.
That's great.
If I may as well, just picking up on that point of confidence. So I'm very passionate about the return to work initiatives that we've been working on with you, Erin, as well. So there's a huge market of opportunity of trailing talent. So not training spouse, obviously we're living in Dubai, majority expat community. I moved over with my husband's role and gave up my career, not reluctantly, I must admit, because I was mid raising children, but wanting to go back into the workplace was really, really tricky because it is still very structured with that whole 9 to 5. We don't have the carer network that we might have back in the UK. But there's been so many great examples through, you know, educating companies to think more consciously about the talent that is here of women that have had maybe a gap of 6 to 10 years. But to your point, sort of, you know, going back in and not remembering how to, once they've worked their systems out, suddenly it all snaps back. And even going through a recruitment process recently for a role in our team, I was so struck by the talent of the women that were sat opposite me that were really underselling themselves, all talked about a lack of confidence. We're all actually independently looking to train you know, going onto YouTube, and Canva was a topic, you know, something that people come up. And I just thought, goodness me, there is a massive opportunity here, because I know through the people that we have in our team, the working mums, for every 1 hour they work, it's equivalent to 3 people in anywhere else I know. We do have a very efficient team. I know we're quite unique, but even still, it's just, you just make it work because you're used to multitasking. So I definitely encourage employers, especially those founders that might not be able to afford the full-time CMO or CFO, to look at that kind of fractional recruitment of somebody that's available between the hours of 9 and 3.
And that's really tip of the spear sort of talent that they're looking at. Someone who's got the experience, can sort of hit the ground running, has certain pockets, of course, of time available. So there's certainly time strapped, but, you know, not without resource or not for lack of resource or talent. Helen, I know since you do a lot of work in this space as well, and you've got your own sort of very unique trajectory as a founder. I was wondering if you could share some of your thoughts there in terms of how, you know, you've navigated a shift in your career.
I mean, how long have we got, really? Well, no, I suppose my driver to start off on an entrepreneurial slant was having my first baby back in 2014, and that's where hopscotch, for those of you who've been around in Dubai and Asia, I suppose, long enough. That's where hopscotch came from, because I, you know, walked into a photography class one morning on maternity leave, and 90% of the women there were there because they had nothing else to do, and they were desperate to get back to work. And they were exactly as Katy said, you know, these incredible women who, when you asked them who they were apart from being just a mum, they had incredible background and experience in HR, in PR, in finance, in running their own business, whatever it was in their own kind of home country. And that's what really lit the fire under me. And that's, you know, my book, as you say, is coming out quite soon. And that is the very beginning chapter of the book, is talking about that experience and just how hard that hit me. because I saw it amongst my own friends, and I'm sure we've all seen it amongst our own, our own circles as well. And it's sad to see that a lot of that hasn't changed, but I do think that the opportunity has changed, and I do think that the way of thinking around this opportunity has changed, and I think that if we can just get away from the kind of more traditional ways of looking at talent, so instead of looking at how many years somebody has done a job, look at what they can actually bring to that
value
job.
they bring to the role.
Exactly. Look at some of the soft skills that they have as well. Look at their transferable skills. Take the dates off the CVs. Black them out. Use technology. There's so much technology out there. That's what Diversely, my second company, was created for, partly, was so that people could make decisions based on whether a candidate was suitable for the role, as opposed to what their name was, where they came from, when they were born, what school or university they went to. These are not relevant criteria for making a decision on whether somebody is right for your business.
Can I just ask, because I know that to a large extent, again, through conversations with various candidates, even at our last Return to Work career fair, as we've discovered, there's two parts to the story. One is self-advocacy, and the other is, of course, the opportunity set being available, which does bring me to ask, how can one, and, I know unconscious bias training goes some of the way, but how can we really get companies thinking differently, get leaders thinking differently and seeing value in, the capability set, as opposed to focusing on the very top line, traditional aspects, more conventional, like you've just said, Helen?
I mean, look, it's proven. There are no end of studies out there that have been executed over the last probably 20 years that tell us exactly why diversity and why gender diversity is important within a business. There is no end of information out there about this. I think AI is now massively helpful in this space. And I'm not talking about ChatGPT, which is
Katy will come to you. I know
a
you've got
very
some
kind of blunt tool, let's say. And, if you were looking to, hammer a nail into a wall, you wouldn't use a screwdriver. And in the same way, I would say AI is enormously helpful where diversity and inclusion is concerned. But make sure you're using the right tool for the job. And ChatGPT is not that tool. ChatGPT merely parrots everything that's ever been on the internet and puts it in a different package. That's not what we're talking about here.
Are you referring parroting in terms of CV writing? Because we know that tends to be pretty standardized and hard for employers to comb through as well. Because I do believe that awareness is required, kind of across the board, really. And I know that ChatGPT has made things really easy for people, including writing CVs. Katy, I noticed that you had something to say when the topic of AI came up.
No poker face here. So AI for me, this is just off the back of GITEX and meeting quite a few startups through Expand North Star as well in recruitment. And I was actually more terrified than impressed with the AI tools that they were sharing. They themselves even admitted that it's almost over-engineered to the point of cutting 50% of the CVs, where there's a huge volume, obviously, when talking large organisations. And it left me wondering, is it fair? Like, when you could actually discount an excellent candidate because maybe English wasn't their first language or whichever language they're applying in, and they've used the tools available, which is a version of ChatGPT, but actually it would be such a shame to discount them because they've actually shown, if they've done it carefully and taken all the red flag words out, whatever, but if they've actually shown that resilience and proactivity in trying to better themselves, that for me is actually a characteristic that I think is quite admirable. So if you have an AI tool that just says nope and then pulls out a word that just by chance somebody who isn't a good candidate has used, then I just can't trust it.
Well, you kind of touched a nerve, but in a good way there, because I think one of the reasons I established Beyond Careers is because I've experienced some adversity when I lost my father. And, at that point in time, I was an 18-year-old trying to get into the workforce. And without getting too emotional about it, I have to hold myself back a little bit. I did find that there was a point where employers were really rigid in their expectations. The questions were directed in a certain way where it fit a pedigree, a certain, whereas what I believed I brought to the table and I proved in over time was that resilience that you're talking about, that adaptability, because while that's something that cannot be conveyed by a piece of paper or an automated CV, if one has the opportunity, and granted, it's also not the easiest thing for a recruiter when they're sort of time pressed as well to just listen to everybody's story, they might have realized or noticed that this person brings other elements that could be really, really valuable, because we can see things in different ways. And I see this for a lot of the mums as well, their ability to multitask, their ability to be really good with budgets and spend. They don't think they are. If you'd ask most women, they say, I'm not great with finance. And I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure you're running your day-to-day expenses every day.
It's very true. I think, you know, at the moment, the angle of I suppose our discussion right now is on the candidate, is how the candidate presents themselves. My argument would be the onus is actually on the employer to ensure that the doors are open as wide as they possibly can be in order to attract the right talent and ensure that the right talent walks through the door. And you do that through inclusive recruitment processes, whether you do that on a practical hands-on level or whether you use technology, you know, which is what I created. That was the whole purpose of creating Diversely, in order to make that fair and equitable for candidates. But secondly, when we're talking about making decisions, there's also, you know, the process of using technology to help you to do that. And that technology has to be ethically programmed. It has to be fed with the right information. There's a very classic case study of Amazon that created an AI actually to do kind of what you were talking about, passing through CVs and so on. But it based all of its inputs on previous CVs that had been submitted, and the majority of those CVs were male CVs. And so when it selected the CVs out of the new pile, it unfairly selected more men than women, right? So there are so many, exactly. So what it's good in, good out, bad in, bad out, and that's how AI works.
Well,
so if you're
prompts as well,
the prompts, exactly. So if you're using the correct prompts, if the technology has been built ethically and with the right inputs and with the right diversity actually of inputs, then the outcome will be positive. But unfortunately, there are no global guardrails against this stuff at the moment. And that's what I mean by saying, use the technology, but make sure you do your homework and look for the ethically built technology that has the right outcomes and that has the right prompts so that you're getting the right results off the back of it. That is really what can help you to then understand whether that person is the right person for the job, as opposed to, you know, whether they spell in a certain way or, you know, whether they speak in a certain way or whether they're from the right pedigree or whatever it may be. That's super important. And the onus there is on businesses
to do their homework.
To do that. It's not on the candidate.
I like that you said that very clearly, Katy.
Yeah, and also just want to bring up around the pipeline of talent. So looking in schools, for example. So I was invited in to speak to some business students before the summer, and of 50 students, 3 were female, the rest were boys.
Okay.
And I was really surprised. So I think even you have to look to ensure the pipeline. You have to go really far back into the school system to understand, are girls being encouraged into business?
STEM careers.
And yeah, exactly. What teachers are role modelling? You know, it starts there. I think we all can remember, you know, far back of what I wanted to be.
The early years.
Yeah, and it was all to do with, well, I relate to that person, or I like this teacher. I mean, something that really, really bothers me is when one of my daughters is enjoying a subject at school, moves into the next year and has a different teacher, switches off the subject because the teacher's not doing a great job or there's a personality clash. And I think, oh, what a stroke. But it's the same. If you look through, just as a manager, you could be working in a, you know, once you're in employment, you're working with a manager that just isn't empathic or isn't a great leader. It reroutes you completely.
When people leave managers, they say, not jobs. So
yes.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think that's actually a really, really good point. And just your point earlier, Katy, about your experience in the workplace and seeing kind of, you know, your line managers or whatever pregnant and seeing that automatically as a negative, there's also such a role there, isn't there, in kind of speaking out, in being the person that leaves at 3:30 or 4 o'clock to pick their kids up and stands up and says, I'm off to pick my kids up, you know, whatever it is, because we've all done that sneaking off the back of the office, out the back of the office thing, because we feel guilty about that.
I've done that dance where even though it means I'm 5 minutes late and then there's a knock-on effect, I suddenly feel this guilt
obliged
where I'm
to
like,
stay,
even just standing chatting.
Yeah.
Like, I think you need to go.
Where does that guilt come from as well? You know, that comes back to your earlier points, Katy and Helen.
It's very misplaced.
Yeah.
It's misplaced, and also it's the environments that we're in. You know, if we work in certain, and I've been part of this. You know, where companies are extremely, and profit is good, of course, understandably, unless they are not for profit. But if they're a profit-centric or profit-driven company, we'd like to see that people, planet, and purpose can really coexist. And I think that's where we're heading with ESG as well, and the role of ESG. But I think from the top down, speaking about representation at board level, if we don't have people at board level to show that empathy, to model that empathy, then that guilt's going to creep up. And I think we've all been there where we've gone, okay, I've got to do this or run for this errand, and then it's also followed by dirty looks. So I think that guilt does come from somewhere.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think, again, it goes back to that question of parenthood as opposed to motherhood, and taking that a bit more, a lot more seriously, actually. And I do think that sometimes we sit here as women and, you know, perhaps it may come across to men who are listening that we're putting them in the naughty corner and, you know, we need that. That's not the case. You know, I think there are so many dads out there, my husband, I'm sure all of our husbands included, who want to be as much a part of their kids' lives, if we're talking about parenthood, as we do. And they are not being given the opportunity, you know, and so it falls to us to create the balance, and it falls to us to try and divide our time. And so, of course, there's going to be guilt.
And speaking of time, I can't believe we're nearly coming up, time to wind down. But thank you so much, ladies. Before you go, I'd just love if you could share any personal breakthroughs, since this is Boardrooms and Breakthroughs. Any last nuggets of wisdom? Helen, we'll start with you.
A lot recently, a lot. Having sold my company this year, and taken, you know, quite a different or progressive steps forward. There's been a lot of self-reflection. There's also been a lot of, I would say, self-forgiveness and self-compassion around what I can achieve and where I want to focus. And, you know, rather than sort of punishing myself for not achieving certain things, just following a path of what actually is working for me and being really, really unapologetic about that. And I would highly recommend it to anybody.
I love that message.
Mine would be, so this is a life hack that when I remember, because this is obviously very important, when I remember, but it was some advice that was given to me around my toxic trait, which is people pleasing. So it was having my own board of directors that's outside of work. So who would be around my board? Who are my stakeholders?
Your inner circle.
So my children, my husband, a doctor, a fitness coach, grandparents that, you know, aren't around anymore, but what would they say? And it's having that life board of directors to understand what would they advise me if I was a PLC? What should I be doing for sustainability and longevity?
Oh, both really beautiful perspectives. I mean, I've learned so much. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you, Katy. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Great having you both here.